You're listening to the People Agenda podcast, brought to you by leading HR, workforce and payroll transformation specialist, Lace Partners. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to the latest People Agenda podcast. That's right, I did not say HR on the Offensive podcast. I said the People Agenda. And the reason why I'm saying that is because, lovely listener, we are going to do a little bit of a shuffle up, a cabinet reshuffle, as the politicians would say, but we don't have any cabinets here. We do just have microphones. And that's the purpose of today's short 15-ish minute podcast, in which I'm going to waffle on at you about why we've decided to change the name of our podcast from the HR on the Offensive podcast to the People Agenda podcast. And to do that, I've got the fabulous Debbie Mitchell with me. Debbie, how are you doing? You all right?
I'm fabulous. Thank you very much for asking.
Debbie, we're going to talk about why we decided to call the People Agenda podcast our new name, the home of the formerly fabulous HR on the Offensive podcast. But I'm going to ask you a little bit of detail as to why we're changing and specifically talk about this. I think we can get into an interesting discussion about the whole HR, or back in the day, it used to be called personnel. It evolved into HR, and then there's people or people in culture. But we're going to talk about that. But before we do that, I'm just going to do a minute or two, if that's all right, about the background of the podcast. So strap yourself in, ladies and gentlemen, for a little bit of a history lesson. So the podcast is, believe it or not, about 5.5 years old now. We started it during COVID, and it all came off the back of a white paper that we produced called HR on the Offensive. Now, that was produced in 2019. And the premise of it really was about establishing the HR function, establishing itself as being a little bit more strategic. We actually had a strap line called Stepping Out of the Shadows, and it was all around this idea around HR and HR teams and CPOs needing to be a little bit more consultative in their approach. I think HR, certainly if you go back 5 years, 10 years, Debbie, it's often been seen as a little bit of a sometimes almost order taking. It's too tactical. It's a function that is the fun police at times. I've heard people label it as that. Yeah. And it doesn't really think strategically. It doesn't think in terms of business-wide objectives. The purpose of the white paper was really just to call out some of the things that businesses can be thinking of. But of course, we then went into COVID. The world turned upside down. We originally thought about just talking about the 6 or 7 chapters that we had in the white paper, but it evolved because of COVID into HR doing so much more. And HR as a function, or the people function, did so much more than just what was expected of it pre-COVID. You had people looking at logistics. You had people looking at employee experience whilst everyone was sat at home, not being in an office. So that brought its own challenges. There's the flexible working, which you and I have talked about on live streams and all sorts, that we now know as norm, but at the time for many organizations was something new. Like many businesses had banks of desktop computers that suddenly had to be redeployed and redeveloped. But I just want to actually just pause and get your thoughts on that and the changes of, maybe we then bleed into or segue into this idea of the evolution of the HR function, the old human resources as personnel, because you've been an HR practitioner, I was going to say, for longer than me. I'm not a HR practitioner, so one day would be longer than me. Could you just give me just some initial thoughts based on that kind of framing of the evolution of absolutely. HR, perhaps?
So you launched the HR on the Offensive podcast in and around COVID. And I think the COVID time was interesting for HR. I think we talked about it a lot at the time. We won't dwell on it, but that HR really did step out of the shadows during COVID and became one of the most critical business functions to enable that kind of continuity. And over time, we talk a lot about the phrase we both hate about HR having a seat at the table and how does it kind of position itself. And that was some of what sort of HR on the Offensive was saying, was we've got to get ourselves in there. We've got to have a voice and operate, as you said, more strategically. And I think that's evolved. So I think lots of people that we talk to, lots of CPOs, lots of HR functions are seeing that they have much more of that role now. And so kind of push for that whilst it is ongoing. We've got to hold our seat at the table. In some organisations and some teams, they do still have to try and get there. But we've seen a much stronger view on that. And so I think that the kind of HR on the offensive headline has been useful over time to kind of position ourselves, but also we are now ready to, as you say, cabinet reshuffle and sort of shape that change. And now start to talk about the people agenda. And there's a few reasons why people agenda is interesting. One is HR stuff really just the business of the HR function. When we talk about things like the experience that people have at work, the workplace they get to operate in, the technology they have to work with, the customer interactions they have to have, all of those things we talk about from an experience point of view are not necessarily owned, driven, controlled by the HR function. We have a strong role in kind of shaping that and bringing that to the conscience of the organization. So it becomes more than just the topics that we talk about are not just relevant for an HR function. I think they're relevant for any people managers, for business leaders, and for functional leaders, particularly around things like facilities, around technology, around AI, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a whole range of sort of people who can take something away from some of the things that we talk about. And then I think it's important to reflect that the nature of the work and the influence that we want to have is changing because let's use the old nugget of AI right now, right? So a number of the things we talk about are either AI-led or are strongly influenced by AI. We can talk about HR technology, so HR systems in the workplace, self-service access, and how AI is helping to drive some of those, but also other things like how's it helping me to develop myself, or how's it helping me to become more efficient? Those kind of things. AI is really leading the charge. And so that's something we need to talk about, which is not directly or exclusively HR related. And we do a huge amount of work across the HR board, and that includes payroll. So payroll is not necessarily sat within an HR function. It's sometimes seen as its own function. Sometimes it's within a global business services. Sometimes it's within finance. So again, it's that kind of breadth we want to appeal to. So we think that the things that we talk about have a broader view than just the HR function. And so we think that they are all based around a people agenda. That's why we've changed the header.
Yeah, love it. So I've got a couple of questions that are a little bit off piece based on just what you were just saying there. Because what we want to talk about, we're going to do a few different things for the podcast moving forward. We've got a few spin-off series that we're thinking about as well. But just as you were talking now, I was thinking about the whole evolution of HR, the HR function. You talk to CPOs quite a lot, or CHROs quite a lot. How many businesses still use will call themselves the HR team versus the people or the people and culture team? Is it a 50-50 split? Is that change, that evolution, that rebranding happening everywhere at the moment?
I see it's happening a lot, but I wouldn't say everywhere. And I hear an argument of what's in a name. So does it matter? Are you still doing the same things? Yes or no? Are you still driving the same agenda? Yes or no? And what we'll typically see, a bit like we saw, so I'm old enough to remember when we switched from personnel into HR, and we all thought, wow, this is really strategic and radical. So it's a bit the same. If you continue to do the same activities, then actually the change of name doesn't make any difference. But if what you're doing is you're setting yourself up to behave in different ways or to provide different services or to advocate for different ways of working, then it might make a difference. And so that's where we see typically functions who might think more about how you're driving the people experience, for example. You might see them more typically as people and culture, whereas those where it's still very much perhaps an ER functional kind of focus, maybe because that's what the business needs, by the way. That's not a critique. The business might well need that. You might see them being more ER or HR focused rather than people and culture, because the two things don't always feel like they resonate terribly well together. So we're seeing a real mix. I still think we see some CHROs, some HR directors, but we do see a lot more chief people officers, chief people and culture officers. And then we see some quite random things as well around chief experience officer is not necessarily random, but I've seen chief happiness officer in a few places. So what's in a name? And I guess the point is, it is what you're being called being reflected in the things that you are focusing on, and that becomes key.
Yeah, and the second one wasn't really a question, but you can build on it if you want, because I was just reflecting on how you were talking about how the remit of the people function is grown. And compared to what we were talking about back in the days when we first created the HR on the Offensive white paper, there are a lot of CPOs who are doing and thinking the strategic part. And this is my sort of it's a complete plug. I'm not going to try and dress it up. Plug for the white paper that at the time of releasing this podcast is already out. We released it in September. It's called From Implementer to Influencer, Redefining HR's Role in Business Transformation. And the premise behind that is it's no longer just HR focusing on its own little world. HR now needs to focus on the people elements of business-wide transformation. So not just thinking about what sort of HR technology should we be embedding into our business. Let's put performance management tools in, let's put in case management tools and knowledge portals and what have you. Actually, it's thinking, what is the people experience for all different types of technology in this example? That could be one lens in which CPOs or the HR or the people function thinks about. Just want to give you a minute or two, just any reflections on the importance of HR in that kind of
absolutely way. It's interesting because we talk about the HR function or the people function need to, and actually my experience is they want to. The research that we did for that white paper said they should be involved, right? They have a different skill set, they bring a different set of perspectives to the table. And in the main, what we also saw in that research is that CEOs really want them to be involved. They really respect their views, they really respect their opinions and their perspectives. And so having that that rounded set of views around the table when we're thinking about transformation in its very earliest stages, rather than we think we're going to have an HR issue as we get down the line with pay, benefits, workforce changes, whatever. It's not that reactive support that HR can really add value in. It's all the thinking upfront about that. And that's what we've really seen. And again, that sort of says HR's role or the people functions role is really about supporting and helping to drive the business forward. It's not about taking the notes and the actions and going away and doing the stuff reactively that has to fall out of that transformation. It's about being at the table for that transformation. And as I said before, because I think it's really important to capture it, is we see lots who are, lots of CPOs are really well involved in their business. And for those that aren't, there can be all sorts of reasons why that is. Not all of their own making, but we just continue to encourage people to get into that transformation space as much as possible because there's a huge amount of value they can add if they do it early on.
Yes, and this is another perfectly timed segue because you mentioned there we want to get a different set of perspectives to the table. You talked about the viewpoint of different kind of CPOs. That's a little teaser and a tee up for you to talk a little bit around a mini-series that you're going to start doing.
Yeah, we've started already recording some podcasts in a mini-series called What is a CPO? And we're looking at different perspectives on that. We've had a couple of CPOs kind of join that cause already and talk to us about what a CPO is from their own experiences. So the types of business that they work in, maybe the types of industry, maybe the size of organization, maybe the geography they cover. So there'll be a huge range of kind of definitions around what a CPO is, does, how it does it, where it does it. And so we'll come back to this in a minute, but a shout out to any CPOs who want to come and be on the podcast and talk to us about that. Whether that's your specific role today or whether that's more broadly, that's what we're interested in, is just different perspectives around what a CPO is. There's a few kind of fundamental questions we've got that sit underneath that. But what I would love, I don't know if we've talked about this, Chris, but what I would love is I'd love a CEO to come on and tell me what they think a CPO is, or a CFO to come on and tell us what do they think a CPO is. We want to get those different perspectives about what that is. So that's one mini series that we've got. I don't think we necessarily call it a mini-series, but we're doing a lot of content now on AI as another example because it's hugely topical. It's an area that we just keep on covering kind of new, interesting debates about. One this morning. So I think it's not necessarily segmented as a mini-series, but I think there might be a few more like that where we say, actually, this is a really interesting topic. Let's get into that and let's get some guests focused around some of that content that we can build on.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm quite excited. And you talked about AI there. So we will we'll proactively go out to reach out to those kind of businesses, perhaps technology businesses that are leading the way in some of that. And we'll start to bring together some more different viewpoints on there. So if you're a chief people officer listening to this, or a CHRO, or a CPCO. Is that a thing, Debbie? Quickly, Chief People and Culture Officer, do they call themselves CPCOs?
Yeah, probably, yeah.
CPCO sounds a little bit like you're an officer marshalling the streets, but that's probably another conversation for another day. Yeah. But yeah, we're going to look to bring in on board more third-party views, and we're going to do some more hosts as well, because I think, Debbie, you and I are co-hosts extraordinaires, but we like to spread the love a little.
Absolutely, yeah. We want to make sure that there's different voices, different perspectives. We've got a lot of expertise across the LACE family, and bringing some of those people in to share their views and to bring some of their connections and their friends, colleagues, clients, etc. to the table as well to join in the podcast will be brilliant. Nothing like a bit of variety.
Yes, exactly. And just a final point just before we wrap up is we want this to be interactive as well. So if you're listening to this and you've got something that you want asked, answered either by us, or even if you have got a recommendation that somebody might be interesting to talk to on the podcast, please reach out to us. We're always looking for new ideas, new speakers, and open to ideas. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it from me. Any kind of final thoughts from you, Debbie, before we clock
really
off today?
Just really excited about the next evolution, if you like, of the podcast. And as we said, getting more variety in terms of some of the speakers, but also really honing our content on the things that are meaningful across the breadth of the people agenda.
I love it. What a great ending to just drop that in for the algorithm. Let's say people agenda a few more times, but hopefully you've enjoyed checking in with us. Like I said, a very quick one just to explain the name change that we've done today. But from myself and Debbie, thank you very much for listening. We'll catch you next week on the People Agenda podcast. Bye-bye.